Hello, guys. It's Dorothy, your host here, and welcome back with another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. Today, I am so honored and excited to have Elizabeth Becker here on our podcast. She began her career as a war correspondent for the Washington Post in Cambodia. She has been the senior foreign editor for the National Public Radio and the New York Times correspondent covering national security, economics, and foreign policy. She has won numerous accolades that we can't even count: the Overseas Press Club, DuPont Columbia's Awards, and was part of the Times team that won the Pulitzer Prize for the 9/11 coverage. She is the author of 5 books, including When the War Was Over, Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge Revolution, and Bo Pana, which is now an award-winning film about a young heroine who was killed in Tulslang. She also, during her visit to Cambodia, was one of the very few who were able to interview Pol Pot himself before his death. We have so much to cover here, Elizabeth. You truly are an expert looking at your experience and what you've accomplished. Elizabeth, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So, before we kind of get into it, Elizabeth, can you give us just a background of how you got interested in Cambodian history?
I was in graduate school at the University of Washington in Seattle. My undergraduate degree was South Asian Studies, which was unusual then, but you're on the West Coast. You know that when you're raised on the West Coast, you look towards Asia, which is totally different than the East Coast. And I became fascinated with India and the countries that were influenced by India. And of course, Cambodia is one of them.
And during your studies, you had became fascinated with Cambodia. How did that translate to becoming a stringer for Vietnam and Cambodia?
I actually tell that story in my book, You Don't Belong Here, how 3 women rewrote the story of war. And it's a very typical of the era. I was writing my master's thesis, and my professor wanted me to become his mistress. And I said no, and he rejected my thesis. I had no recourse, and I actually had a friend who had gone to camp to. She was on her way to do research in Hong Kong and instead stopped in Vietnam and eventually Cambodia to become a stringer herself. And she'd been trying to talk me into going, and I had wanted to finish my thesis and go on and do a PhD, but she knew how interested I was in Cambodia. She kept pushing me, and then finally, when this professor behaved so badly, I had no recourse. I knew that my academic career was torpedoed. So
Wow.
I took my fellowship money and bought a one-way ticket to Phnom Penh.
Even though you knew that there was a war and chaos there at the time, that was something that you were okay with, Elizabeth?
Well, that's why I went,
Yeah.
because okay, the Vietnam War was so much a part of all of our lives in my generation,
Mm.
and why not? Here is an opportunity to witness it and to write about it. And journalism had a strong pull anyhow, even though I was thinking of academics. So it had not been in my plans, but I had the push to, because I had to figure out what else to do in Seattle, and the pull of my friend who said, "You, this is much more important than anything you can do in academia right now."
Right.
So I went, and within I I came right as the peace accords were signed in Paris.
Hmm.
I landed, and they said, "Too bad you missed the war, because you won't have anything to write about." Well, they were totally wrong. Once
Hmm.
the accord, once the accords were signed, the United States directed their attention to Cambodia, and that's when the most sustained bombing campaign began.
Right.
And that's when I really started writing and became a journalist. I was Washington Post, NBC Radio, and Newsweek magazine.
Right. How was the Khmer Rouge or Cambodia perceived at the time in the 70s? Was there a lot of media around it, or was it first initially kind of seen as this other topic aside from the Vietnam War?
Oh, no, no, no. It's part of the Vietnam War. It's
Right.
the reason for all of his many ways that you could fault Sihanouk, he was brilliant to keep Cambodia out of the war. And people, I have to remind people, from 1955, independence, until 1970, Prince Sihanouk had kept Cambodia neutral. It drove the United States crazy. And it was very, very hard to keep up because Cambodia was completely surrounded by countries at war. Thailand was the air base, country to the west. North Laos was part of the war, and of course to the east is Vietnam itself. So he had a tricky time trying to keep neutrality.
Right.
But the border region with Vietnam became sort of like the Moby Dick for General Westmoreland. Remember how he kept saying, if only we can go in, find the headquarters of the Viet Cong, or the North Vietnamese, NVAVC, we can blast it out and we'll win the war. And Sihanouk said no. He played a tricky game. I mean, he had to. He let the North Vietnamese use that small strip in their border as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But on the other hand, he let the South Vietnamese cross over too. And that was the price he paid for neutrality. Now, he got a great deal out of it because the North Vietnamese and the Chinese did not support the Khmer Rouge while Sihanouk kept the country neutral. So Sihanouk did not have to worry about an internal, foreign-supported revolution. Now, the Khmer Rouge were still there, but they were small. When the United States pulled Cambodia into the war by underwriting the country once Lon Nol and others had their coup, they pulled Cambodia into the war. And Cambodia, under Sihanouk, they didn't have an army to speak of, so that everybody immediately went to Cambodia because it was catastrophic. The American policy completely backfired. Remember, if we could only get into the Cambodian sanctuaries, we'd push the North Vietnamese back to North Vietnam, we'd be on our way.
Right.
No, the opposite happened. They pushed the North Vietnamese into
the country.
Cambodia. So
Yes.
instead, within a year, more than half of the country was under the North Vietnamese control.
Right. So I guess my question is, was that all being spread within the New York Times and the news at that time? Being an American, would you be able to be reading about those stories? What stories were circulated through the news, and how was it perceived from the typical American civilian?
Good question.
That was my
Because
question. Yes.
because a lot of wars to this day is battle by battle. So all of a sudden there were it's a new country, new names. Where's Siem Reap? Where's Kampong Thom? What country are we in? And Congress went crazy and forbid the U.S. Army from staying in Cambodia for very long. They had to go back to Vietnam. That left the bombing. So it was, the average American reader would read that about the overthrow of Sihanouk going away, that Sihanouk became the titular head of the Khmer Rouge, but they knew that the North Vietnamese were taking over parts of Cambodia. They knew this battle and that battle. They would have a political story about which Cambodian was going to be in which whatever. Did they have a good feel for the historical nature of this? No. No, I mean, people are still arguing about the Vietnam War, but Cambodia was harder to write about.
Yeah.
Be-
Yeah.
And then nowadays, people will just talk about the Cambodian Civil War as if it had nothing to do with the Vietnam War, but it had everything to do with the Vietnam War. Everything.
Right. Right. Do you believe that this involvement, that this kind of intertwined relationship that Cambodia and Vietnam and America has. This is the reason why that you mentioned that it's hard for us to it's hard to write about, but even to this day, it's not even in the history books. Do you believe that that is the reason why that it's hard for history books to kind of share Cambodia's history?
Well, I mean, in a in a in a brief, yes, but do they want to share it? How much space is given even to the Vietnam War, which was, the first big defeat the United States ever suffered, and 50,000 American soldiers, and
Right.
completely changed. And do they even have a concept of what it was like for Cambodia to have to live next to that violent war for all those years? It's as if we had if Canada had to live through our civil war if it had been up on their border instead of down on the south. It's very, very hard to live next to that war. Um, no, so I think there's no question. There's very little understanding. As I said, it's easier just to say the Cambodia Civil War, the Khmer Rouge won, they're the bad guys. That's the story. With very little, they have a sense that there was American bombing, and some people think the United States actually masterminded the coup. There's no evidence of that at all, but they certainly let it be known that they would support the coup masters. But no, but that goes about it. And so you get these arguments about how much did the bombing affect Cambodia, so on and so forth. Where Cambodia was pulled into that war. If nothing else, I mean, there was. You read the Pentagon Papers from the earliest days in the 50s and 60s, and it's there's if John Foster Dulles, the head of the CIA in the earlier days, said there's no such thing as being neutral in this war. They wanted Cambodia pulled into it, so
Yeah.
it's the bigger war.
Yeah,
And
when
why?
I look back at that history,
Yeah.
when I look back at the history, I'm almost curious on what your opinion is whether or not that neutrality was was worth it, or do you believe that neutrality was what created the circumstance for the Khmer Rouge to rise? Is neutrality even an option when it comes to these circumstances?
Well,
You
I
know?
think the neutrality worked and it blunted the Khmer Rouge. There's no question it
Yeah.
blunted the Khmer Rouge. They did not get support from the Chinese or the Vietnamese, which is one of the reasons they were so angry when they finally won and they
Right.
started the war with Vietnam. So there's no question historically neutrality worked. But how could it work for so long? I can't tell you how long. 55 to 70. Do you know what that means? How much diplomatic soft shoes? I mean, just think Cambodia's Sihanouk was a big figure in the world because he worked so hard at it.
Right.
So, no, the Khmer Rouge, if if I always say if this peace accords, remember that 1968, President Johnson said he would not run for re-election because he wanted to work on a peace accords. 68. If that had worked, because essentially the final one was very close to what 1968 was, if that had worked, there would be no Khmer Rouge victory. The Khmer Rouge were utterly not a military force at all, and it would have been, I don't know, I can't predict what would have happened, but the Khmer Rouge were not there yet, not at all. The only way they got to where they could win was because the Americans pulled Cambodia into the war and the North Vietnamese took it over. So
Right.
neutrality was working. And if the 68 peace talks led by President Johnson had been allowed to flourish, they were blocked by Nixon and Kissinger. I argue, and I think evidence is on my side, that there would be no Khmer Rouge running the country. I don't know. It just wouldn't have happened. And they were anyway. Go ahead. So I'm very much on the side of the neutrality. Look at what they were in '68. They were nothing. They didn't have a military force at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to jump back a little bit. I know that we kind of talked a little bit about the history, but I want to go back to your experience being one of the three to enter Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge as a journalist. How did you get selected to be a part of that?
Okay, well, so we have the Khmer Rouge winning in 1975.
Correct.
The most extreme and the most incompetent revolution you could imagine. And that continues to be part of my argument that they, without the North Vietnamese and all, they would not have won. And they had never governed anything to speak of, so they were completely incompetent. So they did things that normal humans wouldn't do. They had the mass evacuation. They cut off the country. All we knew about Cambodia was the people had been thrown out of the cities, sent to the countryside, to what they called cooperatives, but were sort of labor camps. You couldn't call anybody. There's no telephone connections. You couldn't send them a cable. You couldn't write a letter. They were completely cut off. So we only got information through the few people who could get to the border with Thailand, or through official proclamations, or through diplomats who would talk to you off the record when they came out. So it makes North Korea look open compared to how closed it was. Closed, closed, closed. Extreme radical idea about what it meant to be self-sufficient. Extreme.
Yep.
You take something extreme and it's crazy. So I was back in the United States, in Washington, at the Washington Post. And you can imagine, I'd lived in Cambodia for 2 years. It broke my heart. And I wanted to know what was going on. And I would write letters to the embassy in China, the Khmer Rouge embassy in Democratic Kampuchea in China. And then the one time a Khmer Rouge figure came to the United States was for the UN General Assembly. Ying Sari, the foreign minister, who was also Pol Pot's brother-in-law. He came for the opening session, and I made it my business to go up and talk to him, introduce myself, say I wanted to come to Cambodia, so on and so forth. So I wrote the letters asking to come, and I made myself known to him. And if he ever had a news conference that made news, I would write it for the Post. So I was a known quantity. Fast forward, fall of 1978. The country we don't know how bad it was, but we know that the stories of murder is more and more convincing. The story of hunger is convincing. The Per Bon Cho wrote the book Year Zero. It was already out in French. So we had a good idea that something awful was going on, but we didn't know that anything like so. At the same time, like many a despot, the Khmer Rouge started a war with Vietnam in order to take attention away from the mess they'd made in the country. That's when they decided to invite some journalists in to present a better picture of the country and hopefully convince the United States and others to support them in the war against Vietnam. And that's how I got my visa.
Yes, I mean, reading from the account that you had written in your book, it was an incredibly structured visit with you know, reading the books and watching the propaganda films and stuff that they were showing you, and even as you were brought through the country, seeing, you know, kids who were playing who you were already skeptical of whether or not they were placed there just for you. It seemed very scripted. Did you sense that when you were going through that, and that is that what you expected to experience when you landed there?
Oh, I don't know what I didn't expect anything in the sense that I was going back to Cambodia. I expected to go back to Cambodia, but this was not
Right.
Cambodia. And from the moment I got off on the airplane, I was shocked. It was, I think I wrote, it was like being in somebody else's dream or nightmare or something. And I didn't think the city would still be empty. It was empty
Hmm.
still.
Right.
And it was all propaganda. I could, I couldn't ask to speak to anybody. I couldn't ask to do anything. I they made the schedule. They decided who we would see. They had their spokespeople. It was all 100% propaganda. And they realized that I was sneaking out of our guest house after a few days because I wanted to see the real Cambodia without them. So they started locking the guest house so we couldn't even sneak out. And then they took us around the country, but we spent more time sitting in a car driving all over Cambodia because they didn't want us to get out and talk to people. So yeah,
Hmm.
I got frustrated and they chastised me, and I found out later that they thought for sure I was a CIA agent because of the way I behaved, but I just behaved like a journalist. And sometimes we'd get a peek, but mostly, and certainly, there's nothing like abilities to say, I had to report by what was missing, by
Hmm.
that everything was closed. The temples were all closed, the mosques were closed, the churches were closed, the schools were closed, the markets were closed. There were no homes, individual homes. Everybody was stuck in these cooperatives, which are like labor camps. There were no real doctors. They were all you know, comrade soldiers, the young kids that they taught, and they were very proud that it was like a bunch of children, child labor, and this was the new way to do it. And empty, empty, just an empty country,
Yeah.
empty country, and Cambodia, you can't walk anywhere with someone that's not eating or drinking or dancing, or it's a very lively culture, and it was there's is dead. So yeah, very much you knew it, and I was the one who had nightmares
Yeah. Yeah. I remember you kind of mentioning that in the book as well, that you were experiencing some of those.
because
Um,
my subconsciousness was really flipping out, and I was the only one who had actually lived in Cambodia and spoke Khmer a bit.
mhm.
Don't ask me to say anything in Khmer now. But so they were just, oh, okay, they were, they're reporters, but they didn't feel it, they didn't see it, they didn't smell it, and it was just so
Yeah.
anyway. Yes, I did.
So, that trip was ended up in a very horrible experience. You
Hmm.
mentioned in your chapter of of the visit that unfortunately a journalist of the crew was attacked and murdered, Malcolm Caldwell. Um, I found it interesting that you had mentioned in the book as well that he was invited as a friend
Right.
and not a journalist.
No, he's not a journalist, he was a professor.
He was a professor.
Yeah, he was a professor in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and he was, a big anti-war activist who just went down that path of support of more and more extreme revolutions without really knowing what the revolution was about. He'd already
Right.
visited North Korea, and he's smart, nice guy, but and he'd never been to Cambodia, but he'd already written a book with a Cambodian named Le Tan, and you know, supporting what the Khmer Rouge were doing, just accepting the line that they were feeding the people, they were bringing back, and without realizing, of course, before the war, it's not like Cambodia was not one of those countries who couldn't feed itself. Cambodia could feed itself and feed itself quite well,
Right.
but it was hard, So yes, he was the one. He was the friend. Whereas the other fellow, Richard Dudman, was from the St. Louis Post Dispatch, and I was from the Washington Post. So we were real journalists, and he was a scholar, professor who was a friend.
Yeah, I wonder a little bit more about why we believe that he was targeted and what was the message that was trying to be sent with that. You would imagine and assume that they would want to have somebody who supported their ideals to be the person you know, to still be alive and the one that they wouldn't target.
Well, one, he's not a journalist, So
Right.
he was not going to be writing automatically in a newspaper. Um, Two, he's not American, and I think the American audience is one of the things very important.
Mm-hmm.
And three, I can't give you rational answers for anything that Khmer Rouge did. But the other
That's
thing,
true.
so why would it be more rational with us? But I think the other thing is that the one time I saw him question what the Khmer Rouge were doing was when we had a dinner with Yang Suri, the foreign minister. We had a separate dinner, and Malcolm said he was very upset that the Cambodians and the Vietnamese were fighting each other. He said, "You two fought a revolution together. It's horrible that you're going to fight each other now. You've won your revolutions. Why do you have to fight
Mm-hmm.
each other?" And that's the only time I saw him. Maybe that was part of it. I'm not sure, but it's interesting what the Cambodians said. So so Malcolm's murdered, and we go through this whole traumatic night. They came after me, they came after Richard, they killed Malcolm, and then officially, Yang Suri said the Vietnamese did it, and I said no, no, no. I saw the gunman. He was Cambodian, and I heard the Khmer soldiers outside of our guards trying to find them, and da 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 da. It's all Khmer. So that's the official line, the Vietnamese did it. But in Tool slang, the torture center, some of the last people killed were two of the staff who had been helping clean and cook and stuff for us. And they were accused of this ridiculous plot, and they were accused of killing Malcolm, and they were tortured and murdered at Tool slang for Malcolm's murder. So you have behind the scenes this stupid plot and these poor, unfortunate Cambodians, staff, and then officially the Vietnamese. So within themselves, it was completely inconsistent.
Mm.
My guess is that within the top uh, leadership, there was a big division about whether or not we should have even been invited in the first place, and they wanted to send a message that no more foreigners should be invited. And who best to send that message is the guy who's supposed to be the friend. But
Mm.
I have no idea if they even thought that rationally. They're just, I mean, there you are.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also wonder too, because you also said that he he was interviewing Pol Pot differently in the book from what I've read. He
Right, right.
was interviewing Pol Pot in a different room. You and your other journalist who was with you was in a separate room, and I was just really curious about that separation as to why they were doing that. I don't know, you probably don't know either, but
Oh
I
yeah.
wondered.
No, when we landed at the airport, Dick Dudman and I were put in one car because we were journalists, and Malcolm Caldwell was in a separate car because he was a friend. So
Mm,
that was an important distinction
distinct.
to them. And
Yeah.
then when it came to the interview with Pol Pot, Dudman and I were picked up first in a limousine, driven to the the Great Hall where we interviewed him. We were brought back, and then that same car took Malcolm to Pol Pot to the same Great Hall. Now we had our questions, which were very journalist questions. He had his questions, which were very scholarly. What kind of economic program are we going to blah blah blah? So
Mm,
that's what they talked, how revolutionary economics. We talked politics and things like that. But that was our questions. He ended up monopolizing and with this insane thing that he thought for sure NATO would come and help him fight the Vietnamese. But so that was behind that, and that was
mm,
the way they did it.
I see. I see. Okay.
But what I think is interesting of our trip, besides the fact that we were lucky enough to give this witness and photographs and all that, and I even uh, our recording of the Pol Pot interview. I think it's interesting because it was the first and the last time reporters were allowed in, because within days after we left, the Vietnamese invaded and overthrew Pol Pot. So it's a we could give them it's a good, it's total propaganda, very very restricted, but we were able to give a picture of Cambodia at that point.
Right. Right. And your interview with Pol Pot, he seemed. What did you find it surprising? Did you find his answers surprising when you were interviewing him?
Well, he a lot of the answers were written, and so um, they sounded just like they were straight out of propaganda.
Mm.
And so, but what was interesting was that he wanted to use us to tell the United States and Western Europe that they should be sending their soldiers to help him fight Vietnam, because he was sure the Soviet Union and their satellite countries would be sending troops to help Vietnam fight them. So, among other things, it was paranoia beyond belief that he thought that the Soviet Union would be somehow fighting. But it was, I mean, and it seemed off the charts. But on the other hand, the way everything fell into place in years to come, he ended up getting Chinese support in in exile, as well as American support through their through the working with the Sihanouk troops and the other non-communist troops along the border. So I mean, he knew what he was doing.
Right, right. Do you think he knew that the Vietnamese were going to be invading so soon after that meeting?
Well, that's why we were invited. It was so
Yeah.
soon after the meeting, I'm not sure. I mean, the received wisdom around the world was that the Vietnamese would attack, but that they probably wouldn't cross the Mekong. That
Mm.
it would just be Eastern Camp. They would stop at Eastern
Right.
Cambodia. So there's no question. Khmer Rouge were completely caught by surprise. They left everything, all the documents, the tools, like everything was in place. And when I interviewed the Soviet diplomat who came with the Vietnamese almost immediately, and his testimony is unforgettable about just the corpses, the documents. The Vietnamese were shocked. Everybody was shocked what they found. It was all there. They had to flee like they had no preparation, so they were not prepared for that. No.
Right, right. Did you feel like you got what you wanted from the Pol Pot interview?
Oh, I don't know what I wanted. No, 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 no. By this time, this is the end of 2 very long weeks, and no, no. But it's the one thing I can say is that because of that, I wrote "When the War is Over." I had to figure out
Hmm.
what that was going on, and so it's you just you put your whole self into it, and I would not have written the book without those 2 weeks, no question.
Yeah, yeah. I think this book that you had written, and I've flipped through a lot of books and I've interviewed a lot of different authors, but I honestly do feel like this book that you had written is probably the clearest in terms of presenting how the Khmer Rouge came to be, the history, that kind of the foundation behind it. Um, it's very very clear on how how it came to be, and so I 100% recommend any listeners who listen to this podcast, definitely if you can, or if you're ever curious, because you hadn't learned about the basis of the history, when the war was over is truly a great place to start. So in 1997, Elizabeth, I know that the late Nate Thayer interviewed Pol Pot again, and from what I read, you were supposed to be doing that interview too, Elizabeth, or was that?
Oh yeah, it was it was silly. Yes, New York. So he had an invitation from the Khmer Rouge, and I had an invitation from the non-communists. And when I got there with Steve Heder, who was one of the best scholars, I was there for the New York Times this time. We were blocked, and our general told us that it was because of Nate Thayer's competition, and he wanted, and so he got it. But um, he interviewed a very old Pol Pot who was completely out of power and
Mhm.
said, he had no responsibility for anything. Uh, it's sad, very sad,
Yeah.
very sad. But I want to go back to my book because the one thing I tried to do, and you're going to bring it up in a different context, was because I knew Cambodia was so unknown, I went out of my way to literally people it with normal people. So that's why you got Bopana. I went to find her. I went to find examples of different sides of the story. So the I presume to be mostly a Western audience. I'm very happy that Cambodians love it so much, but I wanted real people because it's so easy to read stuff, the very Western European American mind, you know, average farmer X and average refugee Y, and they have no idea. That's why I had the whole chapter on Vietnam. I began it with, this is the huge cultural difference between Vietnam and Cambodia, because Westernized European Americans, they don't know that. And
Right.
I mean, so I really went out of my way to step back and say, as much as possible, to draw as full a profile of the people, not just the whole. I mean, it was hard to do the history, right? But I didn't think the history would really sink in unless I had real people in it to make to make the reader, have a stake in it, and to really feel what it was like for Cambodians.
Yeah, yeah. No, I found it really, really clear. And I also, going back to the book, I loved the chapter, The White Crocodile, and kind of your the it's I don't know if it's a metaphor or if it's kind of a the symbol in the Khmer world.
Yeah.
For the listeners, do you mind explaining what the white crocodile is, if they haven't read the book? Why did you choose that?
Well, it was sitting there to be chosen. I didn't choose it. It was it was like, I think I'd be remiss if I hadn't accent. The white crocodile changes the my brain is it's late in the day. Um, Changes the flow of the river back and forth every year, because it's um, the Tonle Sap is unusual in the whole world, and it has its own rhythm. And to explain it, you use myth, and that's the white crocodile. So, but it's also auspicious, a white crocodile. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, before the overthrow of Sihanouk, supposedly a white crocodile was seen at the Mekong, and Sihanouk's mother, Queen Kosama, was upset. Her son left the country, and she thought that this was the end, and this would change history. And of course it did. Now, is this after the fact or not? But it stuck in the Khmer imagination, so that the most popular poster during the war years was a poster of the Buddha, serene, and then the princess washing her hair, and the white crocodile over the Mekong. On one side are the Vietnamese dressed up to look, North Vietnamese soldiers dressed up to look like devils, and the other side, good Khmer. And that was the winner. That poster won a poster contest put on by the U.S. Embassy, because they
Wow.
wanted the Cambodians to describe in art how they felt about the war. In fact, I gave my copy of the poster to the U.S. Embassy, and it hangs in the embassy today because it was a brilliant idea. I mean, Cambodians are artists before they're anything else, and so it just it captured the Khmer culture, the Khmer naivety, and the Khmer vulnerabilities, and so much was in that poster, and the whole legend behind it. So that's why, yes, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And of
Mm-hmm.
course, you're Cambodian.
Yeah, and believe it or not, I actually didn't learn about that until I read the chapter, because yeah, my parents never talked about the white crocodile and the legend of that either. So I found it kind of an interesting, a good symbol to kind of signify the changes that were happening at that time period.
Right. And only
Right.
Very Khmer. Anything that could put the reader into the Khmer mind, culture, etc. I grabbed
Mm-hmm.
it. I grabbed it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Bopana, we talked about Bopana, which was you just mentioned, making sure that you had referenced real people to try to draw in the Western readers and the people who don't really know the background of Cambodia. Bopana came in the 90s. That's when that was released, right?
No, no,
19.
no. Opana is in When the War Was Over.
No, but the book that you had written.
No, okay, well, the book I wrote was essentially taking it out of my When the War Was Over. Okay, when the
Ah,
war, so I put it in When the War Was Over. She's right in the middle, and I went to the when I went to Tool Slang when it became open, I wanted to find the file of someone I might have known when I lived in Cambodia. So I was looking for a woman who would have been living in Phnom Penh during the war,
mm-hmm.
and had and the wonderful people at the Tool Slang, the women who were the archivists. When I looked down and I found this name and asked for a file, they almost started crying. It was their favorite file. And
Oh,
so I put her love story in When the War Was Over. And you'll find it on page whatever. And you'll look at Hout Bopana, Hout Bopana. I'll find she's in there. And that's what Richie saw. And that's why then I had to write a separate book because everybody wanted, oopsie. There we go. I almost lost my computer. No, so because I have my copy right here. I'll tell you what page you want to look on. Hout Bopana. Uh,
I don't know how I missed that.
212. Start there. Her whole story. 212. It's right in the middle. The romance of comrade debt, destroying the
Ah,
Hoot Lee Sita and Hoot Bapana were distant cousins. And so so Ritti, back in Paris, Ritti Pan, a young would-be filmmaker, he read it in the French version of my book. And he said, "Can I have the rights for a movie?" And I said, "Sure." He called me from Paris, and he had he has a very, very nice, soft, charming, can get anything out of anybody kind of personality. And I said, "Sure." And so he made the first Khmer language movie about what happened under the Khmer Rouge. And it was the story of Bopana. It played at Tool Slang a whole bunch. And because of all that, then I took that out of the big fat book that nobody's
mm,
going to read and put it in a small book. So that the movie, she was introduced in this book in 1986 in the first so she's been there all along. And
mm.
so then when Richie made the movie, I did the separate one. It was only published in Cambodia because that's where the interest was. And literally, I don't know if they still play it, but they literally played it every day at Tool Slang, the movie.
So it's kind of just by happenstance, to be honest, that they were like, this is our favorite file, and you happen
Well, and
to stumble upon it.
when you're when you're writing a book and you know what you need,
Yeah.
and I knew what I needed, and there were only two files that could have answered my need. The one woman I actually knew, she had been a translator for Japanese journalists, and it broke my heart, but it was not a story. She gave me this one. It's the fattest file in the entire Tool Slang, and it was a huge story. So, I mean, I would be a fool not to use it. And
Right.
why did I ask for it and none of the others? Because all the other researchers wanted the top political figures, and they wanted to do all that.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's the difference is I'm a woman and I wanted a woman's story.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not quite an accident. I think,
Yeah.
I think, and I didn't realize w- another researcher, Steve Heder, who I just mentioned before, he helped me because he understood what I was looking for too with some of the other ones. A young kid who was eventually killed at Tool Sling. He got that folder out for me, and that was definitely, thank you, Steve. I thank him a lot in the book. But yeah, Now I think people are doing it more often, but at the beginning, when they wanted to know what the top leaders were doing and the politics of it, and I wanted the the richness of the story of what, and also, of course, she's a heroine. I wanted a hero, and she was a hero.
Mm-hmm.
She stood up to them. She
Mm-hmm.
wanted to continue being with her husband. It
Yeah.
was a love story. It was based on the old Ramayana. I mean, I couldn't make it up. It was so good, and so I put it right in the middle of the book. What was interesting is that from all of the reviews, no one noticed it until Ritchie noticed it in Paris.
Mm.
But the book first came out in 1986. It was the first full history of the Khmer Rouge.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah, I think it reminds people that these are actual humans, right?
yeah,
They were
yeah,
actual
yeah,
humans
yeah, yeah, yeah.
who had lives and loved and relationships um and I think that sometimes gets lost
Yeah. That's why Anne
in
Frank is
war.
still well known. Anne Frank from the Holocaust, of course.
Right.
And Bopana was compared to Anne Frank.
Right. Right. I read that.
So you can, yes, you're absolutely right.
I wonder then, when you were writing this book, you did mention that this is what you wanted the Western American to get an insight into kind of what the foundation was behind this war. You added these photos, you added your own experience. Do you feel like you feel like you've achieved your goal with this book?
Well, I'm very happy with it, yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, and it continues to sell. So yes,
right,
it's what they call an evergreen. And as you know, I testified at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in 2015, and they all read the book and they were using the book. All the judges says that was very
right.
good, and they asked about Bopana, and so it was the only time she was in the trial. Yeah, I mean, it's like, of course I am, and I'm
Yeah,
very glad that you like it. For instance, when someone like you likes it, that makes me even happier.
yeah.
You're young, you're American, Cambodian American, and you got something out of the book. That makes me very happy.
Hmm. When you were kind of moving forward, when you were testifying as an expert witness during the Khmer Rouge tribunal, what did you find was the most difficult struggle, the hardest thing to prove during the tribunal?
By then I'm at 2015. That it the defense attorneys didn't have much to work on. So I mean that,
Mm-hmm.
and I wasn't proving per se. I was the witness who actually witnessed what was going on. So that was fine. The only problem was the other journalist with me, Richard Dudman, had written stories back in 1978. That's how long it was,
Mm-hmm.
1978 to two. Dudman had written stories saying that he didn't think there was massive human rights or anything resembling starvation or genocide, and he continued to write about that as late as into the 1990s, and so he was called to testify by the defense. So here you have me
Wow.
testifying for the prosecution. He's for the defense, and the one thing the defense tried to do was to make me look bad. So they tried to say that as a journalist, I didn't have the qualifications to write a book that was this serious, and they used a, a bad review. I had only one sort of semi-bad review, and it was by an academic who who himself testified, and it was largely because I was a journalist, and so I had to prove that in fact it was mostly because I was a woman, because he always gave good male journalists reviews and so on and so forth. But what was interesting is that they called Richard Dudman. He testified a few months after me, and the defense said, "Okay, here's Richard Dunman. Now, did you see did you see the genocide, so on and so forth?" And he said he changed his mind and he realized I was right.
But at that
2000.
point, it's too late, isn't it?
Ah, well, too late. It's scary for him. He died not long afterwards. I mean, he's much older than I was, but he wrote after he made that testimony that he'd come to wonder what he would have done if he'd been living in Hitler's Germany, if he would have believed Hitler for so long too. So, if nothing else, it shows you how hard it is to be a journalist.
Wow.
Can I bring up my movie?
Yes, you can.
Since we're talking about this, Richie Pan um, made a feature film, that means fictionalized, a movie about that 2-week trip. It's in French. He's turned the three of us into French journalists and an academic. But it follows the basic storyline. It's called Rendezvous avec Pol Pot. Premiered at Cannes. Wonderful reception, great reviews in the movies for a couple months. And this month it came to Cambodia. So I hope your Cambodian listeners go to the movies and see Rendezvous avec Pol Pot, which they've translated into Meeting with Pol Pot. And it's a tough movie, but I think I hope it gets some. I think it's already started new conversations about war and memory, and that's what needs to be done. So,
Yeah, yeah. I have. I wonder what that interview did to you, Elizabeth, emotionally. I know that it was a struggle for Nate, who had interviewed him 20 years later, and that seemed to have affected him. As a journalist, though, I wonder what it feels like to be so close to something. I'm sure you can feel it in the aura of the room when you're with him. Just just being so close to something that can be so horrific. Somebody that you know that has done so many atrocious things, and being so close to them in that room. And how I don't know what was that whole experience like, and did you feel that emotionally drained you, or affected you in some way?
first of all, Nate's interview was utterly different than mine.
That's
There
true.
no,
Yeah.
there was no danger. He had no danger. Pol Pot was an old man. He was
Mm-hmm.
long out of power. He was under something like arrest from his old comrades. So this was a broken man who would die very soon afterwards. So but at the same time, everybody knew what he had done at that point. Everybody knew what Pol Pot has done.
Yeah.
I was there. We had no proof. He was still in
Yeah.
power. All of this was hidden from us. Um, and he was a vigorous leader. And we were surrounded by armed men all the time. We were under equivalent of armed arrest all the time during our thing. So this was not a walk in the park I mean, nothing against Nate, but I mean, this was
Sure.
long,
Yeah.
yeah. But so, and then he was not attacked. And I think
Yeah.
what drove it home and made it so difficult afterwards to be, I'd been a war correspondent. I'd been in really tricky situations. I'd seen awfulness, but it never been aimed at me. But during that night, the gunman first came in and pointed his pistol at me, and I ran into the bathroom to hide.
Right.
Then he pointed his pistol and shot the bottom of the door of Richard Dudman. Dudman shut the door. And then he went into the room of Caldwell and killed him. Then we were left abandoned for hours in the middle of Cambodia, where there's no telephone, there's no police. I wouldn't even know who to call if I wanted to. So
Yeah.
I was terrified. The terrified doesn't begin to describe what happened. And then when I didn't know what had gone. I didn't know anybody was still alive upstairs. because I was on the first floor and they were upstairs. Then we were rescued and told this outlandish stories that we were Vietnamese, and I said no, it wasn't. So we were taken away and told that so and so was that Malcolm had been murdered and stuff. So it was terrifying. It was terrifying, terrifying, terrifying. So that's a terrifying with a man who would then very soon be proved to be the worst of worst monsters. So yes, of course it had a huge effect on me. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write that book.
Yeah. To this day, I would say, Elizabeth, I mean, you would say that that's probably the scariest encounter that you've had as a journalist?
Bar none. The worst.
No.
Nothing
Yeah.
close to it. Nothing close to it. Nothing close to it.
Did
Nothing.
it
Nothing.
did it scare you? Did you take a pause from journalism after that for a little while?
No, I mean, but it took a lot of good therapy and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, and I think that's one of the, as I keep saying, the book helped me as much as anything else to do that. So I
Right.
understood what I was in the middle of.
Right.
Anyway,
Well, I'm glad that I'm excited for the movie. I'm
thank
excited for
you.
the movie. I hope that it comes out to America where we all can watch it.
Yes.
I am a real big advocate of more media surrounding this topic. Cambodia is often, I think, seen as the silent genocide. There's just not many people gives it the attention that it deserves anyway, you
Right.
know? Something that was so recent, only 40, 50 years ago, and yet when we think about the amount of media that's around it, the books, the lack of books that I feel like we have, that we could have more of, media, I'm glad that Ritti is a champion in that, but I do believe that it really just deserves more than what it currently has. And so I'm excited for your film. I'm so excited that Ritti is going to be highlighting your story. Um, I hope that that it strikes a chord with people.
Same here. Well, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you, Elizabeth. For people who want to find you, yeah, if people want to find you, where can they find you?
My website, www.elizabethbecker.com, and I answer emails.
Perfect, perfect. And what are you currently working on, Elizabeth, as of right now?
Um, a project that I don't know if it'll work out, so I don't talk about it.
Okay.
But
Well, people,
it had nothing to do with Cambodia.
if you are looking to see and find her most updated work, definitely check her out at her website. Elizabeth, again, thank you so much for coming on here. I know that the listeners will get so much value out of this conversation we had.
Well, thank you, Dorothy. Thank you.
Thank you.